This is the North Devon coast, an area of outstanding natural beauty, beloved of generations of holidaymakers, surfers and walkers from the UK and beyond. Behind me you can see Westward Ho and the 3 miles of Saunton Sands, and behind them 2,000 acres of Braunton Burrows, which form the heart of the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve that now extends to cover this entire area. And then round the coast, the popular surfing beaches of Croyd and Putsborough and Woolacombe, separated by these extraordinary headlands of Baggy Point and Mort Point and Bull Point. And then out to sea, the mysterious Lundy Island. The waters around Lundy were the UK's first marine nature reserve, and since 2010, they've been designated a marine conservation area. Then to the north, the outer Bristol Channel, a stretch of water that separates this beautiful coast from the equally beautiful Pembroke and Gower peninsulas on South Wales coast. It's a really extraordinarily beautiful place. But is it the right place to build 200 giant wind turbines? Why would the government give permission for that to happen? In 2008, the European Union adopted a target called 20-20-20.
The European Union is the world leader in the development of renewable energy. It intends to stay in the lead and is committed to reaching the objective of 20% of renewable energy by 2020.
It was a target that was enthusiastically adopted by the then Energy Secretary Ed Miliband and by his successor Chris Huhne.
No more half measures going off at half cock.
Meanwhile, under another EU directive, we were required to close many of our coal and oil-fired power stations by 2016. And by 2020, almost all of our nuclear capacity will have gone, thanks to the dithering of previous governments over their replacement. So, in an attempt to close the UK's looming energy gap and meet the EU target, the government has plans to build around 30,000 wind turbines over the next 20 years. Many of those turbines are being built on onshore sites, but much more ambitious plans, requiring much greater public subsidy, are planned for large-scale offshore arrays, like the ones proposed for the Jurassic Coast, the Bristol Channel, the Thames Estuary, the Wash, and Liverpool Bay, where we met up with local MEP Paul Nuttall.
So Paul, you've got up here in Liverpool Bay some experience of offshore, a reasonable sized offshore wind array with the Burbo Bank array here that was built in 2007. What's that experience been like?
As you can see behind me at the moment, they're not turning at all. There's been problems since they've been built. Firstly, we had problems with the cables in 2009, which meant they were knocked out for 4 weeks. There's now a problem with the grouting and the foundations. And finally, there's problems with the blades, which have had to be changed. They're not really an answer to our energy crisis or energy gap at the moment. And the answer surely has to be to keep open our coal-fired power stations, but unfortunately, the EU's large combustion plant directive is preventing us from doing so. 3 of the coal-fired power stations which we're about to take offline each produce the amount of energy that all of our wind turbines together in this country produce. Whereas the Germans are opening new coal-fired power stations, or even old coal-fired power stations, we seem to be closing ours and building more wind farms. Now, the Germans have 19,000 wind turbines. Not one single coal-fired power station has closed. It's unfeasible, it's unworkable. We're going to have a serious energy crisis. The government have even admitted that bills are likely to go up by an average of 27%.
What should we be doing?
Well, what we should be doing is looking at alternatives. Of course, we should be keeping open our coal-fired power stations, but if you look behind me, we've got the biggest reserve in Europe of shale gas. Now, shale gas itself has allowed energy bills to be reduced in the United States by around 30%. It's something we should be looking at, and I think it's something which could create jobs for this area in particular.
Some of the problems with wind turbines are immediately obvious to the naked eye. Behind me here is the new Fullerbrook Down wind farm, sited just a few miles from where the Atlantic Array is proposed, which, as you can see, has transformed this popular landscape. But there are other issues with wind power generation that are less immediately visible. We asked Philip Bratby, an energy consultant and engineer who spent his whole life in power generation, to explain what those are. So, Philip, why can't these large wind energy installations be the answer or part of the answer to our energy needs?
Well, you have to look at the grid to see how this applies. Basically, the grid supplies electricity on demand, and consumption has to be met by electricity supply. There are 3 functions that the grid does. It supplies base load, which is the minimum amount of electricity we use. It has to supply load follow, which is the variation in consumption during the day. and it has to meet peak load, which is the sudden increase in consumption, for example, at half-time in a major football match. Now, if these three functions aren't met and supply doesn't equal demand, then the grid frequency will start to change. And grid frequency is vital to the control of the grid. If grid frequency goes out of range, then electronic components will fail, and ultimately the grid will fail and we'll have blackouts. So to ensure that grid frequency is stable and supply matches demand, the grid operators use dispatchable power generators, which mean they can control the amount of electricity that's supplied to meet the demand. Now, clearly wind power is not dispatchable. The amount of wind that's on the grid depends on how well the wind is blowing. If the wind stops blowing, then there's a sudden decline in the electricity generated, and the operators are in difficulty trying to provide an alternative supply. Conversely, if the wind gets too high, then a lot of turbines have to be switched off, and there will be a sudden drop in supply from wind turbines, which the grid operators will have to try and meet by getting more power from other generators.
We're frequently told that the wind will always be blowing somewhere, and therefore, provided we build enough large turbines, they will always be able to fill in some of our energy needs.
Well, clearly that is not true. Under a large high-pressure area, the whole of the UK will not be receiving sufficient wind to actually generate electricity. There have been times when the amount of electricity generated from wind turbines, and it happens several times a winter, is essentially 0.0% in round terms.
We're often told that the answer to this essentially is simply to upgrade our rather ageing national grid infrastructure. Is that going to solve the problem?
No, it isn't, because no matter how much we spend on upgrading the grid, we will still be trying to integrate wind turbines when the wind doesn't blow. It won't cure the problem of intermittency. No matter how much we spend on the grid, that problem will remain.
At a time of economic crisis and rising energy prices, highly subsidised and intermittent wind energy seems an odd way to try to avert the looming energy shortages that we expect in the next 5 years. We paid a visit to European Parliament member Godfrey Bloom in Yorkshire to ask why he thinks that UK and European policymakers have effectively bet the future on wind energy, despite the technical and economic problems it poses.
So, Godfrey, why is it that energy policymakers in both Brussels and Westminster seem not to be as aware of the problems with this technology as we are?
One of the big problems I think we have in Europe and the United Kingdom is that we now have something which one might refer to as the political class. People who, with no commercial experience at all, who aren't really geared up to make rational decisions when it comes to things like energy policy or indeed economic policy. Generally speaking, politicians are all lay folk. They're lay people who take very, very simplistic views on things, generally things that they don't know very much about. And energy is no exception. So they follow the line of whoever has lobbied them recently. And of course the Green lobby are running the agenda. The European Union actually gives lobby groups money to lobby themselves, which is taxpayers' money. And of course it's pushed by a political agenda very often, which is the Green agenda, which is a political dynamic. A lot of people think, oh well, it's all there to save the planet. No, this is a political dynamic linked with big business, and so this is a sort of bubble in Westminster and a political bubble in Brussels who seem incapable of listening to anybody else or making any form of rational decision. And this is the reason we've stuck with this problem for nearly 20 years, instead of backing off and saying, well, maybe this isn't how the planet is going, maybe these issues of climate change and these hypotheses aren't working in this particular way, and time to stop and reappraise.
As turbines have been erected in ever-increasing numbers over UK uplands, people have begun to seriously question this rush for wind, which seems to be making landowners and power companies richer, while driving up fuel bills and blighting communities. Increasingly, politicians have seen that their constituents aren't prepared to see their landscape sacrificed in this way. So now the focus has shifted towards siting huge arrays in the sea around our coasts. But does shifting the problem offshore offer a viable way forward, or just magnify the problem?
We've come over here to the Gower Peninsula in South Wales, and as somebody born and bred in the North Devon and North Cornish coast, I feel extremely at home here. The leafy lanes, the countryside, the cliffs, the landscape, and even the Cornish pasties on sale in the shops. These really are two lands separated at birth, and they're separated by this stretch of water here. the outer Bristol Channel, which is really the estuary of the River Severn. And that is where the Atlantic Array is to be built. And we've come over here to talk about it with Malcolm Ridge of the Gower Society.
Obviously, this is a place where people come to see unspoiled seascapes. Do you believe that there will be strong visibility of the array from here?
Well, yes. We're looking across this channel, which separates what are really two halves of one bit of country. If you look at Worm, the Worm's Head out there, the present proposals are for turbines that are probably 4 times as high as that. Now, even if they're a few miles out, 4 times as high as that is going to be seen very easily. What we're going to see, if this plan goes ahead, is 100, 150 towering blocks, 700 feet tall, right in the middle there. And they'll be quite visible, and they'll change the whole of the landscape. It's called the Atlantic Array, but in fact it's the Bristol Channel Array. The Bristol Channel is an estuary, a river estuary, between 2 parts of Great Britain, and 2 very important parts of Great Britain from the point of view of tourism. Large numbers of people come here.
How many a year do you get?
About 3 million.
Wow.
And the income for Swansea City and County is, the last figure was something like £187 million a year, coming into the economy of a relatively small area,
yes,
which makes a huge difference. And so we've got the 2 sides of the estuary, both have exactly the same concerns. It's going to make an industrial landscape rather than an area of outstanding natural beauty and a peaceful landscape. We have a very strange situation in Britain. We've imposed on ourselves a certain level of production of renewable resources, which is fine, and a conservation organisation in a sense can't complain about that. But the way in which it's being done is, for political reasons, it seems to us, it would be much better, in our view, to say, let's stand back a bit, because if there is this huge global change, what we're doing now won't make very much difference at all. If there's not this huge global change, then why are we doing it anyway? At huge expense, both economically, but also, from our point of view, perhaps more important, to the environment itself. To risk that for the sake of turbines that may or may not produce something necessary is really a step too far.
Tourism is the economic lifeblood of areas like Gower and North Devon, where 1 in 6 of the working population is employed in tourist businesses. Walkers, bird watchers, campers and of course surfers are attracted to these coasts in large numbers every year. Veteran surfer Kevin Cook explained to us his concern that large-scale offshore wind farms could have severe effects on areas such as this.
So, Kevin, surfing is obviously very important here, both to the tourist industry and to the economy as a whole in North Devon.
Surfing's massively important here, Steve. The growth of surfing over the years is incredible. I've been surfing now for some 40 years here, so I'm pretty experienced. And the thought that we could see a change in surfing here, as a result of this proposed development, it just fills me with horror. There are some people who are going to be affected directly by the construction of these turbines out there, which will lead to a reduction in the amount of energy. So there'll be certain beaches, mostly on the South Wales side, that will actually start to notice a change in the impact, in the size of waves that they're getting, I believe. Not just surfers, but families come here to the beach. They come here to enjoy these lovely sands here. And they also come for the wider environment, the beautiful scenery and everything. We are part of the Golden Triangle of North Devon, Lundy Island, the Gower Coast and Pembrokeshire. And if you were thinking to put a development in a worse spot, stick it slap bang in the middle of that triangle, surround it by marine reserves, and then put your development in the middle of that and say, please come here and see our wonderful area. Well, it's just not going to happen. The campsites, the guest houses in Woolacombe, North Devon and beyond are now starting to get really concerned that there's going to be a huge slump as a result of this. People aren't going to come here to want to see an industrial seascape. They want to look at what is part of their rightful heritage.
Policymakers are turning to offshore wind because they see it as a neat solution to the public's rising opposition to turbines on their hillsides and in their villages. But power companies want to minimise costs by staying as close to shore as possible. In places like this, in the outer Bristol Channel, the so-called Atlantic Array is planned for inshore waters, only 8 or 9 miles from some of the country's most delicate coastal ecologies. We took a trip on the MS Oldenburg to Lundy Island, where we met up with the island's general manager, Derek Green.
How many tourist visitors do you have here a year?
We would normally expect something like 20,000 visitors over a calendar year. They come to Lundy to experience somewhere quite different. And it's a unique island in that it's been untouched for many, many years. There's no development here whatsoever. You know, we don't have any cars, we don't lock our doors. And there's no industry, you know, so it's a place of wilderness. Yeah. It's a very remote and wild place. And people come to experience that because there's not that many places in the UK, or indeed further abroad, that you can do that anymore. We don't allow television aerials on the island because, you know, it kind of ruins the seascape and the beautiful landscapes that we have here. And so we have to be very careful about what we do allow on the island, and we would obviously be very concerned about anything that happened offshore that would spoil that sense of tranquility and peacefulness. There is a huge amount of concern within the whole of the tourist industry in North Devon and South Wales in particular over the effect that the wind farm might have. I don't think anybody can truly say that it will have a positive effect. And it's difficult to say how it will affect our visitor numbers. I think one thing that is true, that I think a lot of visitors to Lundy will be disappointed should it proceed. So we sat here on Castle Hill, which is the south end of Lundy, and bear in mind Lundy is 3 miles long. The array is going to start to the northeast of us, and it's going to stretch on the horizon as far as the eye can see, all the way around the north of the island and for the same sort of distance to the west.
Right.
And the concern that we have is that the vast amount of turbines that are being proposed here will just create a white line of turbines as far as the eye can see.
Yes.
And so, you know, the beautiful seascape that we're enjoying here today will be gone. It's one of the most dramatic settings that we have here in the UK, and it's such a sensitive area, you know, for wildlife, for marine life, and, you know, we have to consider the amount of shipping that we have going up and down here as well. You know, clearly there's a concern there in terms of, you know, pollution and you know, and collision damage and all those sorts of issues which do need to be answered and answered properly. I don't think anybody would deny that, you know, renewable energy can be nothing but good, and we would be very much in favour of any initiative which, you know, would help to reduce the demand for carbon fuels. But I think one thing that we need to consider is just the siting of this particular farm. It seems to me that it's just too easy to throw up a turbine because you know, there's a mass market for them. The Bristol Channel has got a vast amount of energy here and it's just untapped. You know, there should be more work to go into the development to see how we can use the natural resource here without spoiling the very beautiful seascape that generations of us have enjoyed and that generations, you know, may not yet get to enjoy.
Construction of the Atlantic Array is predicted to take 11 years. The huge turbines, up to 700 feet tall, will need to be anchored to the seabed and protected from the scouring effect of some of the world's fastest currents. Almost 1,000 kilometres of cable will be buried, using high-pressure trench-cutting techniques. Onshore, a 30-metre wide cable corridor will be excavated, leading to a 33-acre substation. Wind energy is promoted as a sustainable resource, but sustainability comes in many forms. Waters like these have been sustaining communities for generations. The inhabitants of North Devon and South Wales have valued and protected this stretch of water and coastline for centuries, because their livelihoods depend on it. That's why the natural beauty and the ecology of this area is as rich today as it was decades ago. We met with local fishermen's leader Bob Gotts to find out just how sustainable the proposed offshore wind farm will be.
So Bob, how big is the North Devon fishing fleet?
Directly and indirectly, you're talking about well over 300 people involved in the fishing industry in North Devon.
Do you think that the North Devon fishing industry can coexist with the Atlantic Array as it's been planned?
People assume because it's the Atlantic Array, massive ocean, the Atlantic, what's a little wind farm? but it's not in the Atlantic. It is in inshore waters. The Bristol Channel fishery is very limited. I mean, we'll lose a massive amount of our prime fishing grounds. That will lead to vessels having to be sold, businesses folding up. Until the talk of a giant wind power station came along, we were looking forward to at least the next 50 years. There's members that have just recently bought more vessels because they're looking to put their families, their sons, into fishing, and they're looking ahead 20, 30, 40 years time, ahead. It's long term.
Well, that's quite remarkable, isn't it? I mean, we hear a lot about the deterioration in fisheries around Britain's coasts.
You'll find that there's been no deterioration in our fish stocks, which is a credit to our fishermen. The gear they use is very selective, so there's not a lot of discard waste. All the pots have got small escape panels, so immature shellfish can leave the pot. They're on sort of free accord. We've got an area just north of Lundy, which we put aside, which nobody fishes for 6 months a year. We negotiated using the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations with the Belgian fishing industry to see if they would agree to impose the same voluntary no-take area as we do, and they agreed to it. So that was done without any government interference, without any politicians. It was just done between the fishermen who believe in a sustainable future. We haven't got an issue with the wind farm. Our issue is the fact that it's proposed to be sited right in the middle of our prime fishing grounds, which will destroy our industry in North Devon. It's as simple as that.
The British government have claimed that hundreds of thousands of new jobs will be created in the so-called Green Industrial Revolution over the next 20 years. Promises of jobs in construction and maintenance can sound attractive to communities with a need for new economic investment. But what are these promises worth? Do wind farms bring new employment and prosperity to areas like this? Local artist and activist Christine Lovelock believes that these benefits are not what they seem.
People are very disappointed with all the promises that the wind energy companies make. They talk about local jobs. Well, everybody here around in this area knows that Fullerbrook created no local jobs. We know nearly all the people who worked on the wind farm came from abroad. They were brought in, they're specialists in various parts of the construction. It's done nothing for local people at all, except cause harm. People who've got bed and breakfast up on these hills, and people used to come to them for tranquility, for peace, because to get away from London, to get away from industry, to get away from noise, and then what do they get? Noise in great giant industrial structures. They won't come back. That's the truth of it. So there'll be jobs lost, not jobs won. When I first heard about turbines at Fullerbrook, I didn't even know myself what I thought about it. I had to look into the subject. I found it really difficult to get it across to anybody else once I became involved, what the size of these turbines would be and how imposing they would be and how they would change the whole character of the landscape here. It's changed completely since the Fullerbrook turbines had gone up. I mean, the fact that you can see these turbines from Dartmoor, who would imagine that? None of us realised you could see them from Barnstaple. In fact, there are very few parts of Barnstaple where you can't see these turbines, and yet they're miles away from the centre of Barnstaple. If the Atlantic Array had been proposed before Fullerbrook had been erected, then there wouldn't be much of a controversy about it. People would think, oh, they're a long way out, nobody will see them, they're not going to be very noticeable. If these 22 turbines that are only about 360 foot tall are so visible, what would the Atlantic Array be like with 400 turbines, or possibly ones that are much bigger than these, some 9 miles away? It's not very far. And that is really concentrating people's minds in Devon in a way that it would never have done if Fullerbrook hadn't been built first. People who had originally thought that they were quite a good thing are beginning to change their minds. The knowledge is getting around now that they don't work so well. 3 or 4 years ago, if I'd raised the subject to somebody locally, they would just look at me blankly. Now, if the subject comes up, they say, oh, they don't work, and they seem to have learnt much more about it. It's a quite different situation now. The public are becoming aware of the problems with wind turbines, that they don't save the planet, basically. They don't reduce CO2 emissions very much at all, if at all. They're realising that the government just isn't acting on this, and that perhaps these are just a fig leaf. They're no help at all.
It's that increasing public awareness that now presents the greatest obstacle to the government's push for wind power. In a survey we conducted for this film, we found that a clear majority of people in this area want no more wind turbines erected here. And the second highest reason they gave, at 43%, was because they don't believe that wind is a viable means of producing large-scale electricity and plugging the country's energy gap.
People are no longer prepared to accept that wind is the answer to saving the planet. They've looked into wind energy and they've seen its shortcomings. Of course, the biggest reason people gave for saying enough is enough is the effect that these great industrial machines have on the environment.
While European energy policy is in turmoil, with Europe backtracking on the huge discoveries of shale gas, and with growing opposition to the EU's demand that we shut down perfectly good power stations while facing a period of serious energy shortages, people simply won't put up with this flawed strategy that despoils their land and seascapes.
Decisions on these major infrastructure projects are now entirely political. The decision on the Atlantic Array here and on other projects planned, such as the array off the Jurassic Coast in Dorset, will be made by the Coalition Energy Secretary, Ed Davey. In the face of the opposition from another coalition comprising the National Trust, the AONB, conservation organisations, tourist businesses, fishermen, activist groups and a large proportion of the voting public, it does seem that a decision to give the go-ahead to this project would be, in the words of Sir Humphrey Appleby, very brave indeed.